Are we ready to go? I think we're good. All right, the doors are closed. You all made it in out of the coffee hour. Welcome. Welcome to week 3 of Exile 101 written in Babylon. It's good to see you all. Today we're going to be moving into a new section. Last week we talked about the Torah, and this week we're going to talk about the books of history. So we're going to start with a little review. And I'll just give you, so as a heads up, what we're going to do today is we're going to do a little review, then we're going to do some stuff that's like a 50,000 foot view, and then we're going to do an activity, and then we're going to dig in to some details. So that's what you can expect. Deuteronomy, a brief review from last week. We ended with the book of Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Torah, and talked about it being the first and the beginning of what is a Deuteronomistic history. This tradition of going back and looking through your history and not just telling the facts as they happened. I'm not saying they didn't happen this way, but the goal of the author isn't just telling the facts as they happened like we would think about writing history. The goal of the author is answering specific questions through the telling of history. So this tradition includes books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Deuteronomy, even though it's part of this tradition, got lumped back in with the Torah, which we talked about last week, because it's got Moses in it. That's the big reason why. And it ends with, and we'll see maybe a theme here pop up, it ends with Moses telling the Israelites outside of the promised land, he says, follow God's law, keep God's covenant, or else. Or else. He even goes as far as to say, you're going to mess up, Israelites, you're going to mess up, and you're going to eventually be taken out of this land. A little bit of foreshadowing to the exile where these texts were compiled and edited significantly. The key questions of this tradition for you to keep in mind are, why are we in trouble with God, and where did we go wrong? This is people in the exile, people taken out of Judah into Babylon, going, either there's two things happening here. One, God wasn't powerful enough to save us from Babylon, or God is letting us be taken by Babylon. And in that case, what did we do wrong? Where did the break happen? So they look back at their history, and this is what this tradition is designed to do, is to answer that question. So for a 50,000 foot view, I want to first start with this trigger warning. These are the nasty bits. These books are graphic, these books are violent, and there are strong themes of violence and sexual violence that are going to be part of this lesson today because it's in the Bible. So fair warning. We'll start with the book of Joshua, which is the first book after the Torah, after the Pentateuch. And this book the events take place around the year 13th century BC. Now there is some debate, scholarly-wise, about how accurately the events in this story are told, if they ever actually happened in a historical perspective or not. Evidence is mixed. In fact, I did a project in college once that was analyzing Jericho, which is one of the major stories in this book, and I found that there have been about 4 major archaeological digs of the Jericho site in the last 200 years. And the first one was someone who went to prove that the Bible story did happen in that time, actually just like it did. And they found evidence that it did, that it happened exactly like they said. And then someone about 40 years later came around and was like, they're just a bunch of Bible bashers. It didn't happen. I'm going to go prove that it didn't. And then they proved that it didn't happen. And then someone was like, yes, it did. And I'm going to go prove that the Bible happened. And they went back and they found more evidence to prove that it did. And then someone else went back and was like, no, the Bible stories aren't real. And they found evidence that it didn't happen. So we know nothing. Archaeology. But the stories, according to the book, happen around the 13th century BCE, and it circles around in Joshua the conquering of the promised land, the land of Canaan, that they come up to from out of Egypt. And the book includes rules for how to divide the land from one another, how to live within the land, and its most famous story, there are some other military stories, but the most famous story in there is the fall of Jericho, the first major capture and defeat in battle as they walk into this land. The main lesson of the book of Joshua is when people are obedient, when people follow the law, when people keep their covenant with God, God wins for them. Your numbers in military, your skill with the sword, none of that matters, because as long as you keep God on your side, God will win for you. And that's why this is the promised land, and through the covenant being kept, the promise was kept, and most of the land of Canaan in the book of Joshua is delivered to the Hebrew people. And it ends, this is interesting, it ends with a warning from Joshua. Before he dies, he gathers up the people of Israel and goes over how to live in the land, and he specifically says, keep the covenant with God. Follow the law, or else. That's near the very end of the book. We'll go to the next one. Judges is the following book. This one happens over a much longer period of time. This goes from, the stories happen from about the 13th to the 9th century BCE. And this book follows really a cyclical pattern. It's the descent of Israel into moral chaos. So what we see in this book is there's the law, the covenant with God, and then the Israelites, the Hebrews, they break it, and then God lets them be oppressed or conquered because of it. And then through the oppression, they repent, and God appoints a judge who is, we call them judges, they're really more like a chief or a captain. They're a leader in that way. But they are appointed a judge who then frees them from the oppression, usually through show of force. And then they're free once again to try to keep God's commandment. But guess what they do? They mess it up. And it goes down and down this spiral, because as we go through this book, the judges that we see kind of care less and less about God or keeping God's laws. So not only does the people of Israel make mistakes, but the leadership kind of gets progressively worse. There are some key figures in here that we know a lot. Gideon was a very powerful judge, led a lot of military victories. Deborah was the only female judge, a very significant character. And then we all know the story of Samson, who's actually the final judge in the book. Some of the most famous stories in Judges include Samson and the donkey's jawbone, where he slays thousands of Philistines with just a bone from a donkey. Also later ends up destroying more Philistines by famously collapsing the pillars he was chained to, right? There's the story of Gideon's 300 soldiers, which is the one, if you remember, Gideon is leading people into battle, and God says, no, there's too many of you. There's too many. If you win the battle with this many people, then you're just going to be like, we're so mighty and powerful, so you have to have less so that you know it's me, it's God who led you through. So God says, okay, send a bunch of people. Anyone who's scared, send them home. So they get down to like 10,000 people. And God says, no, that's still too much. That's still too many people. So God says, Gideon, tell all your men to go take a drink from the river. And he watches them. And some of them scoop water up with their hands to drink, and others bend all the way down and they lap it up like a dog. And God says, take those 300 who lapped like a dog, and those are going to be your battle going in against this powerful, powerful army. And those 300 go in with Gideon, and they win. And it's a great sign of this deal that we've been talking about. If you are obedient, if you follow God, if you follow the law, and you listen to what God says, God wins for you. But the key message in this book that comes along as we see the spiral of descending leadership and descending moral chaos is that Israel has rejected God as their king. The idea of judges is we don't have kings, we have judges because God is the king of Israel. We don't need to be like every other nation that's around us and have one person be our supreme ruler. God is our supreme ruler. So we have judges to help enact God's will, but not kings themselves. But as the judges go on, and we get to Samson's actually the worst of the judges in this book. He's seen as a hero often in Christianity, but he's the worst. He cares the least about living life the way that God commands it to be led. And we get to this point where we realize, Israel has rejected God as their king and is seeking out powerful human military leaders once again. There's a story that leads off of this. But there's a section at the end of the book that has this verse twice. And it says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And that precedes this last story, which is graphic and gruesome. And it's designed intentionally by the author to get your attention, to let you know how far Israel has fallen during this time. It's called the story of the unnamed woman. So how the story goes is there's a Levite, which is the tribe of the priests. There's a Levite and his concubine, not necessarily his wife, but his concubine, and they're traveling home, and they stop to spend the night in a city called Gibeah, which is a city of the Benjaminite tribe. They're stopped in the square of the town, preparing to spend the night outside of there, and an old man comes up to them and takes them in as his guests for the night. Then this happens. While they were enjoying themselves, the men of the city, a perverse lot, surrounded the house and started pounding on the door. They said to the old man, the master of the house, "Bring out the man who came into your house, so that we may have intercourse with him." And the man, the master of the house, went out to them, and he said, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man is my guest, do not do this vile thing. Here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Ravish them, do whatever you want to them, but against this man do not do such a vile thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine, and he put her out to them, and they wantonly raped her and abused her all through the night until the morning. As the dawn began to break, they let her go. As morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. It's a brutal, brutal story. That's not the end either. It gets worse. Does anyone recognize this story, though? Does it sound familiar to anybody else? Because as I read this, I was like, this story sounds familiar. It sounds like this one. A story called Sodom and Gomorrah, which is in Genesis chapter 19. Let me read you this story and see how they compare. The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. "My lord," he says, "please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night, and then go on your way early in the morning." "No," they answered, "we'll spend the night in the square." But he insisted so strongly that they did go with him and entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and they ate. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him, and he said, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything with these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." "Get out of our way," they replied. "This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play judge? We'll treat you worse than them." And they kept bringing pressure on Lot and moved forward to break down the door. Does it sound like it's the same story? It kind of does. This is where we look at the history of this tradition, the Deuteronomistic history, and we say, oh, the author's trying to show us something. Because Sodom and Gomorrah are the worst of the worst. They are the examples of what a sinful culture, a sinful civilization looks like. And now we see that in Israel, this has happened. I'm going to read you the story of the unnamed woman, of the concubine, the end. In the morning, her master got up, opened the doors of the house, and when he went out to go on his way, there was the woman, his concubine, lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. "Get up," he said to her, "we're going." But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man set out for his home. When he had entered his house, he took a knife, and grasping his concubine, he cut her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. Then he commanded the men whom he sent, saying, "Thus shall you say to all the Israelites, has such a thing ever happened since the day that the Israelites came up from the land of Egypt until this day? Consider it, take counsel, speak out." This is the beginning of Israel's first civil war, following the body parts being sent to each tribe. 11 of the tribes called the tribe of Benjamin to account and say, "Bring us the people who raped this woman." And the Benjaminite tribe wouldn't. So 11 tribes went to battle against one, and they decimated them in battles. The Benjaminites ended up fleeing into nearby territories. And out of fear of becoming extinct as a tribe in those nearby territories, they went and kidnapped hundreds of young women to reproduce with. And then we see the very last verse in the book. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And that's how it ends. There's a message being sent here, right? These recorders of history are showing us Israel fell far, far away from the way that God had intended for them to live, for the way that they were supposed to be set apart as a nation, as a civilization, with different ways of treating one another, of treating the foreigners, of treating women. They have fallen far. And it's in this way attributed to there not being a king. So I'll give you a guess as to what the next books are about. They're about kings, and lots of kings. We're going to get into those. But before we dive into those, which we'll get a little specific in, I want to do an activity together, which is going to help us understand a little more how these authors are writing and from what kind of perspective they're telling stories. So we'll take a little breather from that heavy story. It's literally the most brutal story in the whole Bible, of the unnamed woman, or the Levite's concubine. And we're gonna take the piece of paper that's on your tables. There should be one for each of you, and take a pen. And I'm just gonna have you write a little letter. We'll take a few minutes to do this. Write a letter to someone who is young, a child. It can be your child. It can be your grandson or granddaughter. It could be your childhood self, just someone who's young. And I want the letter to happen in two parts. The first part, write to them a list of warnings. If you could give someone warnings, what to avoid, what not to do, what warnings would you give to this child? Some examples I listed were what kind of people might you want to avoid, how you don't want to waste your time or money, or how not to treat your family. Those are just examples. And then in the second half of the letter, I want you to give a list of positive advice. Instead of don't do this, do this. What do you want them to do? What should they invest in? How to become the best person? How to find joy or happiness as types of examples. It doesn't have to be my example. It should be you. It should be based on your own life, on your own experiences, the things you've learned. And try to pass on some of your wisdom using one half as a list of warnings and the second half as a positive advice. You can write this as paragraphs. You can make a list, whatever is easiest for you. We'll take 5-6 minutes to do this, and then we'll... All right, I'm sorry to cut anybody off if I am, but we have more to get to. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for doing this activity. I want to ask you, go ahead and come back to your seats if you moved. Thank you. I want to ask you a couple questions about your conversations at your tables. First was, just by a raise of hands even, how many of you felt that your top list and your bottom list kind of paralleled one another? Did anyone feel that? I know we had some over at our table. Yeah, there's some of that around. How many of you noticed similarities between the different advice that was offered at your table? Was there some of that? Would someone share a little of just one of the common themes that you heard at your tables? We all had them.
Be kind and considerate to others.
Kind and considerate to others.
So that's the positive one. The negative version of that is don't be a bully.
Don't be a bully. Okay, yeah, so those paired up really nicely. What else? What else did we notice that was a common theme at our tables? Anyone notice some more similarities?
Exercise and being healthy.
Oh, do that in here for me so everyone can hear you.
Exercise and being outside, healthy.
Taking care of your body.
Yep.
That's great
Food.
Positive advice. Excellent, yes. Yes, was there a negative side of that at your table? Or no, was it all positive? I love that. That's good. Don't eat Twinkies, that didn't make it in. Anybody else? Maybe over here, was there a common thread at your table? Any commonalities? Anyone else's group? All right. Okay. We'll move on to the next thing then. We have stuff to get to. So, I I had this arranged this way on purpose, believe it or not. Because there are different times in our lives when we need to hear both pieces of advice, right? Like there are times in our lives when we are feeling the consequences of something, or we are barreling toward the consequences of something, and we need warnings, right? We need danger ahead, trouble is coming, and in fact, what you're feeling right now, you need to know how you led yourself into this. You need to know that you missed these steps. You need to not do these things if you don't want this to happen again. That happens. We need those times in our lives. We also have times in our lives when we're trying to do well, when we're trying to do the right thing. And a bunch of telling us what not to do isn't very helpful. It only instills in us fear, the ideas of all the different ways we can mess up. And we need positive advice, right? We need, you can do this. You go do this thing and you'll reach your goals. Encouraging advice. We need both of them in our lives at different times. And we actually see this expressed in the Bible through a couple different collections of history writings. And I want to cover those for the last 19 minutes that we have in a very specific way. We don't have time to cover them in depth. As a brief overview, what we're talking about is a collection of writings that we know as Samuel and Kings, and a collection of writings called the Chronicles. These two cover about, the Chronicles covers about 50% the same material that's in Samuel and Kings. They're very, very much overlapped to the point where if you read them, you're going to go, wait, didn't I already read this? Why are we doing this again? Because there's a lot of the same stuff in there. Samuel and Kings goes by a few different names. In the Hebrew Bible, it is the Book of Samuel and the Book of Kings, so just 2 books. In the Catholic Bible, at least throughout most of its history, definitely up until the 16th century, even some still do now, they call it 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kings. There's no Samuel mentioned, they're all kings. And then in the Protestant Bible, starting in the 16th century around Martin Luther's time, we see 1st and 2nd Samuel, the book is split in 2, and then 1st and 2nd Kings, that book is split in 2. If you ask me my opinion, which you didn't, but I'll give it to you, I think the Catholics got this one right. I'll step aside for the lightning bolt. All right, we're good to go. These books are all about kings. That is what the focus is on them. Samuel and Kings, these were written during the exile, or at least initially written during the exile. They were probably continued to be edited a little later, but during the exile, the people in Babylon wrote this retelling of history, and it starts with Samuel, who's the prophet, which is why those first 2 books we know of as Samuel. It's during his lifetime, and then it goes into more kings in the following 2 books. Key figures that we know from here: the prophet Samuel, King Saul, the first king of Israel, King David, King Solomon, David's son, and various other kings of Israel and Judah. They cover a lot of them in the last part of Kings. The key question of this collection is, why did we end up in exile? We've already seen this happening in the history tradition that we've been studying today, but now we're getting even more specific because we're getting closer and closer to the time of exile. We're getting right leading up to it in the historical sense. So they're really focusing in on these questions of what went wrong. In Chronicles, on the other hand, this collection is written just after the exile. So probably during the Persian period, when the Persians have taken over Babylon and have let people go home. We know that Israelites or Judeans are coming back to Jerusalem, and under the leadership of a group of prophets are trying to rebuild the city walls, rebuild the temple, restart their religion in Jerusalem. And this book is written during that period, Chronicles are. They're focused on Judah only, as opposed to Samuel and Kings, which tells stories of the northern and the southern kingdoms, Israel and Judah. Chronicles is focused just on Judah, because it's all about these people coming back to Jerusalem who were Judeans. And the key figures in this, it really, really focuses in on specifically King David and King Solomon. Now, one of the things is, Chronicles, some people say, is maybe a bit whitewashed as far as history goes. Because the key question here is, how can we trust God after the exile? How can we know we're right with God? So many of the stories from Samuel and Kings go with, there's a sin, and then God punishes. And God doesn't just punish the person who sinned, God punishes for generations. So how do we know, now that we're going back to Jerusalem, that we're not still punished, that we're not still cursed? How can we know that we're right with God? What gives us a chance of doing what all of our ancestors failed at? Yeah, Mary. Here, let me bring this to you.
During Lent, as we all know. And where does that fit in? Where does the book fit in here? And it's lots of lamenting about this exile.
I'll take that. That's good. Lamentations is written in exile. It's written during exile. That's a great story. A great question. It's a writing, not necessarily a historical book. But we will probably get to it in like the last week if we have time. Yeah, it's another text definitely written in exile about these questions. What went so wrong? Woe is me. Yeah, that's a great question. So we're going to look at these two books. I'm going to try to prove to you that this is happening, that we have these two different questions going on, and we're going to do it through dealing with David. Specifically, we're going to focus on 3 stories in our last 15 minutes of how these books talk about David. The first one, we're actually going to kind of work backwards chronologically through David's life, but the first one is this census that takes place. I'm going to read you both accounts of this and see if you notice what the difference is. In 2 Samuel chapter 24, it says this. Now again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and it incited David against them to say, "Go number Israel and Judah." We'll skip ahead a few verses. Now David's heart troubled him after he had numbered the people. So David said to the Lord, "I've sinned greatly in what I have done. But now, O Lord, please," I don't know what that is supposed to say. That is a typo. Oops. Ooh, there you go. Anyway, please punish me accordingly is basically what David says there. When David arose in the morning, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Gad, who's David's seer, and he says, "Go and speak to David. Thus the Lord says, I'm offering you 3 things. Choose for yourself one of them, which I'll do to you." So Gad came to David and told him and said to him, "Shall 7 years of famine come to you in the land? Or will you flee for 3 months before your foes while they pursue you? Or shall there be 3 days of pestilence in your land?" So to understand a little bit of what's going on, in the story, David took a census. Censuses are bad. Censuses are bad because they are trusting in your numbers, not in God's power to win might. You take a census so you know how many soldiers I have. And as we've already heard the story of Gideon, right, and his 300 men, God is not concerned with how many men you have. God is concerned with, if you trust me, if you follow our covenant, I will win for you. But David takes a census to determine the size of his military. So that's the 2 Samuel account. 1 Chronicles account. Then Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. So David said to Joab and to the princes of the people, "Go number Israel from Beersheba even to Dan, and bring me word that I may know their number." God was displeased with this thing, so he struck Israel. And David said to God, "I've sinned greatly, in that I have done this thing. But now, please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly." The Lord spoke to Gad, David's seer, saying, "Go and speak to David, saying, 'Thus says the Lord, I offer you 3 things. Choose one of them.'" And God says, "Either 3 years of famine or 3 months to be swept away for your foes while the sword of your enemies overtakes you, or 3 days of the sword of the Lord, pestilence in the land, angel of the Lord destroying throughout the territory." So we have the same story, census, then an apology, and then a punishment. What's the key difference? Anyone see the key difference between these two stories? What'd you see, Pam?
Satan said in Chronicles,
Uh-huh.
and in the other one, God troubled David.
So you're saying in 2 Samuel, it says the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and the anger of the Lord incited David to go and take the census. And then in Chronicles, it says Satan stood against Israel and moved David to number Israel. I don't know about you guys, but I think those are different things. I would hope that the Lord and Satan are different. So why would these switch? That's because of the reason we just talked about. There's a different need in Israel when they hear this story. In Samuel, when they're writing from exile, trying to understand when things went wrong, they need it to be about the relationship between God and humans. And actually, at this point, David and God are already on bad terms, which is why this whole story really is a punishment of David. David's previous actions, saying now God's making you do worse things because that's all part of the punishment. The relationship is already broken. But in Chronicles, Satan enters the picture and Satan does it. Because it's not about a broken relationship between God and humans. We need that relationship to be good because the people who are reading this are going back into Jerusalem and trying to rebuild, trying to restart. So in this story, the author needs Satan to be the one, an enemy, an adversary, to be the one who comes and starts the trouble. It tells the same story with a different emphasis that gives a different takeaway to the reader. Yeah, here, I'll bring this to you.
It also, I taught a class not too long ago about the history of the devil.
Yes.
And I used this exact example here as a representation of the development of the figure of Satan throughout the Old Testament and even through the intertestamental writings about how Satan gradually became a figure separate from God.
Yes.
Right? And
Yes.
so this is an example of the development of the concept of a figure representative of evil throughout the entire Old Testament.
Yes, absolutely. Great, Steve. Thank you. Was there someone else with a hand up? Oh. I want to pass that over to her.
My question has to do with the first one under Samuel where it says, incited David against them. Who do you think them is?
I think that's referring to Israel.
Just curious.
Yeah, I think that's referring to Israel. But it wouldn't be, if you're wondering if it would be about God or gods, that would not be unusual for a little bit of multiple God action to be happening behind the scenes. Because at this point, not monotheistic religion, but they believe generally that there are lots of gods around, but the God of Israel is the biggest, best, and the greatest, and is ours. So that is possible. Yeah, question over here.
So which punishment did he pick?
70,000 people died. It was a pestilence. Yeah, it was. It did not go well. I don't think David chose. I think he just kind of tried to bargain, and then it all went bad. God picked.
Didn't he say, I would rather trust the Lord and have my punishment come from God?
That's what it was. You're right.
But
Yep.
I always wonder how come, well, God would bring the enemies on, or God would bring this on, so how is any of it not God?
It's all God. It's all God. You're right. There's definitely a confusion between how much of it is God's agency and how much is human agency, and that really is in picture in the 2 Samuel story. 1 Chronicles cleans that up just a little bit. Let's go to another one. We're running out of time. Bathsheba and Uriah. This is painting on the right. This is Bathsheba at the bath by Rembrandt, one of the most famous depictions of this biblical story. This is how the story goes in 2 Samuel chapter 11. It says, it happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, this is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So David sent messengers to her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returns to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. That line in there about purifying herself after her period is interesting. What it's saying is, the bath that David saw, likely, was a ritual bath that has to take place monthly for women after their period. And it also happens to mean that following your period, you're in a pretty good space to conceive. So it's talking about a cycle, too, which has to do with why she got pregnant. So then we're pretty familiar with the story. If you've seen VeggieTales, David, yeah, I know, we've seen VeggieTales, right? David calls for Uriah, he meets him, and then he ends up sending him out to the front lines of battle and instructing the army to withdraw away from him so that he is surely killed on the front lines. He has him murdered. And the news gets back to Bathsheba, and it says this, when the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him. When the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. Then there's this line, but the thing David had done displeased the Lord. As a result, David gets cursed, and the prophet Nathan brings this curse to David. This is what happens following. He says, your family is going to be cursed. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom, and I gave you the house of Israel and Judah, and if that had been too little, I would have added as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You've struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah a Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house. I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in broad daylight. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and in broad daylight. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, Now the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child born to you shall die. So, following this, a series of unfortunate events. First of all, the child that Bathsheba was carrying did die. She later had another child named Solomon, who becomes king of Israel. And then also this series of events happen. David's son, Amnon, rapes David's daughter, Tamar. Now, it kind of goes into details to specify that Amnon isn't exactly Tamar's full sibling, like probably siblings from different women, but Amnon rapes Tamar. And then Absalom, who is Tamar's brother, gets mad and kills Amnon. And then all of David's sons flee, so he's left with none of his sons left in Jerusalem. But then Absalom comes back, and he usurps the throne for a little bit until David flees away, and then he has to return and kill his own son to reclaim the throne. Talk about trouble from within your own house. We see this generational curse that's happening now, and it's going to affect years and years on of Israel's kinghood and of David's household. Guess how 1 Chronicles tells this story? This is the whole slide. There is no mention of Bathsheba or Uriah or the curse against David or any of it in Chronicles, because they deemed this is probably not helpful to getting back to feeling like we can be in a right relationship with God once again, that we can have our own king once again. All of these things, they're like, that would be too negative, so it's not there. One last short story I want to talk about. This is God's covenant with David, and this is going back even further. This is at the beginning of 2 Samuel chapter 7. It says, When your days are fulfilled, and you lie down with your ancestors, I'll raise up offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish your kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings. But I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me, your throne be established forever. In accordance with all these words and with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David. So those are words from God, a covenant to David. Here's how it happens in 1 Chronicles. In this one, Nathan says that God says, When your days are fulfilled and you must go be with your fathers, I will set up one of your descendants after you, who will be of your sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build for me a house, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son, and I will not take my loving kindness away from him, as I took it from him who was before you. But I will settle him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever. According to all these words and according to all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. Whose house and whose kingdom? This is the big key and the difference between these two. In 2 Samuel 7, verse 16, we see God says, Your house, David, your kingdom, David, will be made sure forever before me. But in Chronicles, God says, My house and my kingdom will be made forever. Even if you're on the throne, this is my house, the temple, and this is my kingdom. This is God's kingdom. This is a theological shift that we see happening here that was necessary from going into exile and coming back, Because when you went into exile, you had all these questions, not just of where we went wrong, but how permanent is our relationship with God? Can we go too far away? Can we mess up too bad so that it never comes back? These are one of the key questions that the chroniclers coming out of exile are asking. And they tell these stories to encourage the permanence of God. This theological shift happens during the exile largely thanks to the prophets, which just happens to be what we're going to talk about next week as well. So we'll dive into those. Does anyone have any questions before we wrap up? I'll walk around with the microphone. Yeah, come into this table. Yeah.
In 5 minutes or less, tell me everything that you said before I came in.
Before you came in today? Oh boy, you're gonna have to go back and watch the YouTube. This class is recorded if you want to see it twice.
There are wars everywhere, and you think about Ukraine and Russia. Now, is God on one side and not the other? And what about in Africa, was it, where the two looked almost alike to me, and one was alienating or killing all the others? So
Yes.
how do you know? Is this a God and punishment, or what's going on?
Yeah, you're asking a key question that happened during the Enlightenment in Europe. During all the religious wars, when people finally went, wait a second, if everyone's fighting on God's side and they're all fighting each other, maybe something else is going on here. Yeah. Any other final questions? Do this for me.
It's like a theme from Game of Thrones.
It is like Game of Thrones. Hey, you think Game of Thrones is bloody? You got to read some of these books sometime. That'll give you a run for your money. Or sexy. The Bible gets pretty sexy too. I'm just saying. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming to this class. I'll see you back next week to talk about prophets.